It's been a spectacular week in Syria. The world had written off the rebellion that began in 2011, believing Assad, with the support of Russian air power and Iranian militias, has consolidated his rule. In the past weeks, it has been reintegrated into the Arab League, and it just seemed the best the revolution could accept was a rump state in Idlib. There are many who have not followed the developments in Syria over the past 13 years of revolution, and we at The Thinking Muslim will dedicate some of our shows to reveal the facts and provide important analysis. Now, today we have Razan Saffour to give her account of the Syrian revolution. Razan is a Syrian researcher and an activist. Recently, she has been speaking to the international press about developments in the country. So we're honored to have her with us today on The Thinking Muslim. Razan, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to The Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much, Muhammad.
Well, Razan, it's been, I think it's not an over-exaggeration to say that it's been a spectacular week. I mean, do you believe that one day you may actually return back to Syria?
I think for the first time in a long time, yes. Honestly, it's been a week. It's been a week, and I don't think I can accurately describe all of the feelings, all of the emotions that not just myself, but a good number of Syrians have been going through. Like you mentioned in the intro, the Syrian context did sort of reach a stalemate at one point, and a very bad stalemate. So it wasn't just, a stalemate where nothing was happening. It was a stalemate where people were still being bombarded every single day, where the regime and Russia and Iran and Hezbollah have been bombarding, cutting off access to aid, and essentially we've been struggling with finding solutions to a lot of things. We've seen the normalization of the Assad regime by not just by the Arab states and by the GCC states, but also by Europe. And I think all of that had just sort of brought down our morale collectively, but also me personally, it really brought down the morale. I used to pray a lot to see my parents enter Syria again in their lifetime, of course, for the first time in 43 years. And up until last week, let's say from, I think, around 2015 until last week, I came to this understanding or cognition that wasn't going to happen, that wasn't going to take place. And it weighed down on me every single day until last week. I feel like actually, that might be a reality. Inshallah.
Well, inshallah. I mean, I think it'll be amazing. I think there are commentators who are now saying that Assad is in a very precarious position. I mean, it does seem to me, however, that there's still a long road ahead. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Both in terms of bringing Assad down, but then also after. I think this is just the beginning. This is the pre-beginning that we've been stuck in, sort of the pre-game. And then the real work starts after we've liberated ourselves from the Assad regime. But on the Assad front, for example, like right now, we're seeing him struggling. We're seeing actually how weak and fickle Assad is without his allies, without Russia, without Iran, without Hezbollah, all of whom have taken, massive blows. Iran and Hezbollah on the Lebanon front, on the Gaza front, where they have fronts against Israel, and then Russia with their front against Ukraine. They no longer have their consolidated power all in Syria as they did in 2016 and 2020. And so they're not able to crush the rebels as intensely as they did, essentially. And I think that's a huge blow to the Assad regime. And honestly, I don't know if he'll be able to recover from it. By the looks of it so far, no, because Russia hasn't actively brought weapons and ammunition in as we all expected it to. Russia is bombarding right now Idlib and Halab. It is contributing on that front, but not as intensely as it used to. It used to carpet bomb constantly. They used to have a scorched earth policy, which there's still a lot of fear that that's going to take place. But so far, despite the violence that is already taking place and that has been taking place, for their standards, it's been pretty reserved.
I've got so many questions to ask you, Razan. I want to ask you about the last 13 years. I want to ask you about the prospects for the future. But, it has been pretty amazing just how quickly the rebellion has taken some very key cities. Aleppo in particular is now under their control, and Halab is semi under their control. And it seems to me that it will fall to the rebellion sometime very soon, inshallah. So there is movement in a very positive direction. Do you have only positive views about the road ahead? Like, are there any reservations you have about just the expansion of the rebellion so quickly and so fast? Yeah.
I mean, absolutely, there are reservations. And I think, especially in the first few days, apprehension overtook the joy. The joy sort of reigned supreme when they took Halab, but that the apprehension has still, it's sort of like reclaimed its space as the number one emotion. And for several reasons. Firstly, none of us understand what's happening. None of us understand how it's happening. None of us understand the rate at which this is all happening. It's happening really fast. This has never happened before in the history of the revolution. Even previously, I mean, this is the first time ever that the Assad regime loses complete control of Aleppo since 1963.
Right.
That's before the Assad regime even came into power. This was when the Ba'ath went in power. Yeah, so it's the first time this has happened, and even when the rebels were in control of Aleppo prior to 2016, prior to the fall of Aleppo in December 2016, they didn't have complete control of Aleppo. They only had control of East Aleppo, whilst West Aleppo was under regime control. Yeah. So this is the first time that this has happened, and this is the first time, but it's also, and sorry, if I might add, it took Qasem Soleimani and Russia 3 years to be able to conquer Aleppo, culminating in the fall of Aleppo. So it's actually really insane when you think about how Aleppo fell in the space of 2 to 3 days. I have no analysis on that, genuinely, and I don't think a lot of Syrians do either. And I would be very cautious of anyone who says that they do know how this took place. I think, I mean, we're aware that the rebels have been working on an offensive and an operation for quite a long time. They announced it. It's been public information. On a separate front, Turkey has also or had also spoken about sort of limited or reserved operations, not to be confused with this operation. Obviously, there is some collaboration with Turkey, but the extent to which people say that Turkey is involved in this one is very, very exaggerated. But I think no one assumed Aleppo. No one thought Aleppo would be liberated or will be liberated at such a fast pace. And in 2024, there were no indicators as to that.
And there have been some positive signs about just how the rebels have treated local populations, treated minorities in particular, but also very positive signs of political prisoners being released from the dungeons. And I think that's the only way to describe it, the dungeons of Assad. Can you talk to any of that?
So absolutely, there's been a lot of positive aspects. Obviously, it's a mixed bag, but I'll speak to the positive aspects, and then I'll speak to the reports of the negative aspects. As you mentioned, the prisoners being released. I mean, that was, I think, the first thing on everyone's minds, just seeing those videos of people seeing daylight for the first time in 8 years. Wow. Women running out. We've all seen that video, the first video of the prison in Aleppo, where a good number of women were suddenly running out. I mean, for me, that was the most emotional because just imagining what it takes for you to be a female prisoner, knowing what Assad does to women in prisons, or the Assad regime, rather, what it does to women in prisons, and then suddenly being told to, gather your stuff and you're free, and you don't even know where your family are. You don't even know, if they're still in the country or not. You don't know if they're still in the city or not. Just knowing that you want to escape so bad in order to not go back there. And that's what we were seeing. We were seeing women running, fumbling, stumbling, and other people also. We've also seen the reuniting of families. Very beautiful reunifications, sons with their mothers, sons with their fathers, brothers together. it's been very beautiful and also very heartbreaking, kind of like just understanding the gravity of what was taking place all of those years. These people were just kilometers apart, you know, just kilometers apart. You know, when we speak about apartheid, when we speak about apartheid Palestine, and we're speaking about the wall and there are families on each side of the wall, it's a very similar conceptualization of that. And there's no wall. There's just the Assad regime and the rebels. And if you cross over, you'll get killed because you'll be perceived as a traitor.
Yeah.
Simple as. There's also been reports on the treatment of minorities. Now, because HTS have quite a radical background, or they stem from a radical, more extremist background, though since they've claimed to reform and they have genuinely been working on certain aspects of reform within their ideology and within their general kind of like national framework, there's been very valid concerns as to how they are going to treat minorities. Some of them are steeped in Islamophobia, but some of them are very, very valid, given just in general how certain extremist and radical groups have previously treated minorities, particularly those of different sects, and those within the Christian faith, the Yazidi faith, or Shias, Alawis. Or on the flip side, those when they treat Sunnis, those Sunnis are primarily the majority when it comes to the Arab world. There's been a lot of fear-mongering at the same time. So there are valid fears, and there's also been fear-mongering, particularly pushed by Assadists. But what we've seen, for the most part, we've seen an embracing of minorities. We've seen a rebel leader speaking to minority groups and leaders in a mosque, telling them that we're all from the same country. We are all brothers and sisters, and we're here to protect you, and we're here to build up a nation together. We've all seen that video of the lovely Christian aunties speaking and saying that, you know, we're fine, we're good. You know, they haven't stopped us in doing anything. And if anything, they gave a tongue-in-cheek comment saying that we just want the water back because the water was cut off for a few days. We've also seen a video of a presumably rebel fighter. I'm not sure from which faction. I also assume HTS, since HTS are primarily in control of Halab, taken down a Christmas tree. And since that went viral, immediately there was a statement issued saying that fighter or that person was taken and disciplined, and there were pictures of the tree being restored. So there's a lot of effort on that front. There's a lot of effort to showcase that actually, you know, they're trying, or actually they are showing that they don't have an issue when it comes to minorities. And also, to be fair, I think we also have to speak to HTS and their treatment of minorities in Idlib. There are minorities in Idlib. There are Christians in Idlib. And for the past few years, they've been working with them. They've been allowing them also their spaces. They've been allowing them their just to be able to live and practice their faith freely. So I think there's also some sort of rupture or dissonance when people speak about, well, how are HTS going to treat minorities? It just showcases that they haven't really been keeping up with what's happening in Syria, because Idlib isn't void of minorities, and despite that, for the most part, minorities are living just as every other sector are living. On the negative sides, and I think it's also important to note that whilst we support the liberation of our homeland, essentially, and whilst we support the resistance against the Assad regime, it's very important to note the difference between supporting the resistance against an enemy and supporting the group or the groups doing that resistance. I think this is generally understood. Gaza, in a very incredible way, actually allowed for the opening of this discussion when people realized the necessity of having a Palestinian resistance, resisting against Israel, resisting against oppression. Many people, or a good number of people, don't necessarily support Hamas, but they support the acts of Hamas. They support the act of resisting against Israel. And this should be applied to the Syria context. And this is how many Syrians are seeing the context right now. Many people are very confused, myself included, about the groups. I don't necessarily know if I trust the groups themselves. As much as we're seeing great PR, as much as we're also seeing their what they're doing, the liberating of the lands, the liberating of political prisoners, their work with the minorities so far, and how they're tolerating them. And also the way in which they've improved in Idlib, because not to forget that they've been governing Idlib more or less for the last 4 years. And they haven't done such a bad job, though they have been authoritarian. That has taken place, and we have spoken up against it. And we do know the implications of this. And we do know the implications of an armed group with a particular ideology, or an armed group in general, regardless of which ideology, and its engagement with power. One of the other negative elements that we've seen, and actually most of the reports that have been coming out when it comes to violations, when it comes to sort of looting, when it comes to just thuggish behavior, has been primarily linked back to the SNA, the Syrian National Army, who are Turkey-backed, or Turkey-funded rather. One of those acts, especially the one that's gone most viral, has been against the Kurdish population, or has been rather against Kurdish individuals, beating them up, kind of like just humiliating them. And there's been a lot of conversation around that, where some people are saying, well, it's fine, it's not like they're subjecting them to the violence that the Assad regime usually does, or even how the SDF subjects, Arab Sunnis to a certain level of violence. But at the same time, it's never okay to humiliate anyone. It's never okay to treat, particularly when it comes to citizens, particularly when it comes to civilians, it's never okay to humiliate anyone in any capacity. This is exactly what we are, this is exactly what we actually stood up against. One of the first protests in 2011 was because an Assad police officer humiliated a vendor and humiliated someone on the streets of Damascus, and we went up and we rose. Well, I say we, sorry, I should say, and the Syrians at the time, the residents of Damascus took to the streets, and the chant that they were chanting was "Al-Maut wal al-Madhalla," which means death and not like, yes, death over humiliation, essentially. And this is how we should be treating. We should be treating everyone with dignity. We should be treating everyone with just basic, human adab.
So that's really interesting, because the way you describe it is these are exceptions, and at the moment the leadership and the main rebellion operations are focused on Assad and focused on the opposition, and they are not historically we know that the militant groups, when they entered an area, there'll be reprisals against even those that were connected in a very far off fashion to the opposition, and that's what gave some of these militant groups a bad name. So there seems to be a change in their approach to the population. I mean, do you think that time in Idlib, where in particular HCS had to acclimatize to becoming a government effectively and run in civic services, that has actually been a positive thing for them?
For them, definitely. It's allowed them to grow. It's allowed them to understand. It's allowed them to also experience how they engage with the Syrian population. And we're speaking also about probably the fiercest Syrian population, because a lot of those who ended up being in Idlib are a lot of those who were forcibly displaced from all over Syria for being anti-Assad, for being anti-regime. So you're speaking about that segment of people. Obviously, not all of them were forcibly displaced. Some people remained. A lot of other people also became refugees, or they became displaced elsewhere. But a lot of the families of opposition, a lot of those who ended up leaving from Ghouta, ended up leaving from Madaya, ended up leaving even from Halab, ended up leaving from Hama, they all ended up going to Idlib. So you have this population of very fierce, for the most part, very fierce revolutionaries, and also very fierce Idlibis, because Idlibis, like the people of Idlib, they're a very strong-minded people. They're very beautiful people, very incredible people, very trusting, very trustworthy, very just, bent on justice. These are generally the characteristics of the people of Idlib. And so it must have been actually very tough for HTS itself to learn how to deal with them. And then know its own limits. And I think it's still a work in progress, because like I said, HTS started off something, and it also started off much more authoritarian than it's showing us now. I don't want to make any statements that might be wrong, because also there needs to be an understanding that we could just be seeing PR right now. We could just be seeing that. That is a strategy of war anyway, in order to kind of like ensure that people don't turn against you, because they know that they need people's support. They know that otherwise they won't be able to liberate. And so they've also, if it is PR, they've played it really well. If it isn't PR and it's genuinely them reforming and them attempting to become much more of a moderate national group with a more Islamist sort of like framework and understanding, then they might just be doing something that a lot of other rebel groups weren't able to do.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your family in Syria. Do you still have family in Syria? And what's you mentioned earlier that your immediate family haven't been back to Syria for many decades. Just speak to that for me, Razan.
I'm the daughter of exiles. I've never seen Syria.
Right.
I've seen Syria from a hill in Kilis, which is on the border of Turkey. Where my father's friend once took me when I was working in 2015 on the borders, and I saw rural Aleppo from there. But otherwise, I've never stepped foot in Syria because my parents were exiled in the 1980s. My father is a former detainee. He was detained several times between 1979 and 1980 by the Assad regime. Excuse me.
This is Hafiz Assad, the father of Bashar
al-Assad. Yeah, by Hafiz Assad. He was tortured. His back was broken. His nose was broken. Each time he was taken for about 3 weeks at a time. And then eventually my father was tipped off that he was going to be taken for good. And so he managed to essentially leave from Homs to Damascus to Lebanon, from Lebanon to Jordan, from Jordan to Yemen, from Yemen back to Jordan to Spain, eventually arriving in the UK. So their migration or displacement route or refugee, even though they didn't use that term at that time, is very interesting how they went around. My mother, on the other hand, 2 of her brothers were detainees. Her father was taken on behalf of one of her brothers who the regime couldn't find. The rest of her brothers managed to leave. So my mother's entire family were implicated. With my father, it was just him. But with my father, because he was implicated, it kind of like caused harm for his family. And there's a huge kind of like psychological element when you think of that, when you speak to that, how people felt at that time, because they were a minority speaking up against the Assad regime, or they were a minority being involved in some sort of organizing. And that meant that the entire family were implicated if the family didn't collaborate or cooperate rather with the Assad regime. And it didn't happen to my family, but plenty of people were killed on behalf of the family members. That was a way to enforce not just fear, but it was a way to force the opposition members to succumb to sort of like the regime's intimidation tactics. But onto my mother. So my mother is the youngest of all of her siblings. My mother and 2 of my uncles were the only people in the family that weren't detained. My uncles, for the most part, all of them were involved at that time in just general opposition to the Assad regime. And so 2 of my uncles were taken. One of my uncles was killed and tortured in prison. My mother never got closure from that. And yeah, it took us a while to understand what trauma does to a person. It took us a while to also understand how it affects us generationally. So with my mother's family, 2 of her brothers were detained. This one that I just told you about, who was killed in prison. He was tortured and killed in prison. A very graphic story of how that happened. The other spent 17 years in prison. He's actually currently now in Turkey, in Istanbul. They ended up leaving Syria in 2015. They came to Hatay, and then They were caught up in the earthquake. Their entire house was destroyed. They thankfully managed to get away with just a few scars, and I managed to bring them to Istanbul, to where I was staying at the time, until I found them a place to stay. And they've settled here now. But my uncle, that's my uncle who spent 17 years in between Tedmur and Sednaya, which are notorious, some of the world's worst prisons, experiencing some of the worst torture ever, also still has torture marks. And not just torture marks, it's also still very much present in the way in which he acts, despite him being released in the year 2000. So it's been, 24 years, and he's still very severely traumatized, if he can even acknowledge that trauma. My aunt was detained on behalf of her husband in, I believe, 1980 or 1981. She was pregnant at the time. They tortured her, and she had a miscarriage. She waited for her husband for 17 years, assuming he was dead, but still wanted to wait. And then he obviously was released, and they were reunited, but it was a different type of reunification after a very long, lonely 17 years. And when my mother left Syria, her father was detained on behalf of her brothers who are wanted by the Assad regime. So she never saw her father for a last time. Wow. My mother left and never went back. She left assuming she was just going to leave for a few weeks. That was the same case with my father. That was the same case with everyone who left at the time. They thought we're just going to leave for a few weeks. They're out kind of like now hunting everyone down, doing some massacres, but I'll calm down and we'll be able to go back. And it's been 43 years and we haven't been back. In terms of my extended family, so I've had family all over the world. I think I have family both from the first generation of those who were forced to leave from the 80s, and I have family from this second generation of mass displacement that started in 2012, and I have family still left in Syria. So I have an aunt in Aleppo. She was actually in central Aleppo, in Aleppo city. She still is, rather, in central Aleppo, in Aleppo city, and she was living under regime control up until last week. My mother's older sister, and we also have an uncle in Homs under regime control who actually we can't really reach out to. It's very dangerous for my father particularly to reach out to him. It's always been dangerous for my father to speak to any of his siblings, given my father's history in human rights. And my father finds out news about his brother through his other non-political or kind of like non-politically active brother.
What you construct there is really a regime of fear. Did this regime of fear extend beyond political opposition to or opponents to Assad? Like the impression sometimes we're given is that before 2011, Assad was not as tyrannical as he is now, maybe. I mean, I remember it was Hillary Clinton who called Assad a reformer. And the general impression in the West was that Syria was a different type of Arab state. Tell me whether, what was the general repression felt by normal people in Syrian society?
People were a shadow of themselves for the most part. People lived lives. They lived normal lives, but they weren't allowed to express their opinions. They could express their opinions about, things that weren't dangerous, essentially. But there was no democratization, no understanding of, no conception that anyone can speak about politics, no conception that anyone can speak about basic amenities, no one can speak about how the state operated. Even if it wasn't opposition, the moment you were heard speaking about something, you were immediately taken. Like, it was very much a kingdom of fear. There was a saying that for every person there are two mukhabarat. Mukhabarat are state intelligence, and oftentimes they're just dressed as normal people, so you don't know who's who, you don't know who you can trust, who you can't. And the Assad regime really did this, like from Hafiz Assad, but also Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad kept this, and actually capitalized on it very much. This regime of fear, this kingdom of fear, where people couldn't trust each other. And when you can't trust each other, you can't organize. When you can't trust each other, you can't get together. For the most basic of things, people weren't allowed to actually group together. If you were in public in a group more than 6 people that wasn't sanctioned by the state, you were hunted down. You were taken immediately. You were either dispersed or you were taken immediately if it was suspect to the state. A lot of the halaqas, a lot of the religious sort of circles that took place, they were either state sanctioned in mosques or they were done in private. And if they were discovered to be done in private, then people didn't know what the ramifications were. It depended on who you are. It depended on who found you. It depended on the mood of the officer at the time. It depended on what they perceived your ideology to be. So people lived. This is what I mean by people lived a shadow of, of themselves. They lived pretty much normal lives. They went to school. They, had their ayad. They had, their family gatherings. It was a good life. Also, I assume, so I know from my family and friends, I can't speak to it definitively because I've never been to Syria, like I mentioned. But then at the same time, they weren't able to express, they weren't able to group together, to even think about something. They were warned away from that. Families were split apart because of it. So if someone spoke their mind about something, their parents or their siblings would be very afraid for them, and they'd end up kind of like, having family issues because someone wanted to speak their mind, someone didn't, was too scared that, that would, render them a detainee or would get them, taken away.
So in essence, it was a regime of fear. I want to turn to some of the arguments against what's happening at the moment. Now, you've seen on Twitter in particular, there's been, in particular, the left, the anti-imperialist left, or some of them, they have come out very forcefully against this rebellion, and they tie it into what's happening in Gaza and argue that, in essence, this weakens the Gaza resistance and it weakens the so-called axis of resistance led by Iran. Just talk me through the rationale there. Is there anything there that you could potentially cite which has some correctness to it? Like, is this rebellion taking important resources away from what's happening in Gaza?
Absolutely not. There's no indication in any capacity, or anyone who's actually been following, anyone who's been watching the genocide in Gaza over the last 14 months, there's no indication that the Assad regime has actually been useful in any capacity to the resistance against Israel, or to the Gazan people themselves, even to the civilians themselves. What has the Assad regime done? Genuinely, I'm asking, what has the Assad regime done? Have they sent aid over? Have they resisted against Israel? Have they fought against Israel? Israel has been bombing Syria almost every single day over the last year, and arguably also over the last 12 years. People assume that Israel started bombing Syria just over the last year. No, Israel has been bombing Syria over the last 12 years. For the most part, they have been targeting Iranian depots or Iranian weapon depots, Iranian weapon sort of like storage. But over the last year, it's intensified against civilians. Again, they tend to take out those from Hezbollah or those from Iran, because Iran and Hezbollah are, to an extent, fighting against Israel, and they are fighting on that front. But what has the Assad regime done? The Assad regime hasn't even responded. Like, they haven't even responded rhetorically to respond physically, tangibly. They haven't fired a single rocket. Over the last 2 months, Israel has been redrawing the occupation lines of the Golan Heights. Of the Golan Heights, rather, sorry. We call it Jolan in Arabic, of the Golan Heights. And the Assad regime has done nothing. In fact, the Assad regime hasn't even acknowledged it. And it's called us liars for bringing it up. It's called the opposition liars. And it said that nothing has happened, when they've been redrawing lines. It was either 1 month or 2 months ago, Israel conducted a raid in southern Syria. I can't remember if it was in Damascus or between Damascus and Daraa. I believe it was in rural Damascus. It targeted an Iranian IRGC official, someone within the Revolutionary Guard. Israel was in Syria. Like, I can't explain to you. Israeli soldiers, there was about 30 of them. They were inside Syria conducting a raid as if they were in the West Bank, as if Syria was an extension of occupied Palestine. And Syria didn't do anything. It didn't even say anything. It didn't even acknowledge it. And even when it was leaked by Israeli media, and it was picked up by all of the other medias, Syrian media still didn't say anything, didn't even acknowledge it.
Why is that? Did Assad just want to keep his head down and not get involved with the conflict?
I genuinely, I don't know, because I don't buy into conspiracy theories, or at least with this, I'm not sure where I stand on this. And I'm going to be very honest, because a lot of Syrians say that Assad is collaborating with Israel. I don't necessarily believe that, but I do believe that both Assad and Israel are aware that the most ideal scenario for Israel is for Assad to stay. Assad isn't a threat to Israel at the moment, even though rhetorically it says stuff. Rhetorically, it has threatened. In practice, it has done nothing. Even when it attacks, for the most part, it attacks Iranian and Hezbollah factions within Syria, because they are, as much as I dislike them and as much as I have hatred towards them, they do have a front against Israel.
Why do you hate them, by the way?
Because they've been killing us. They've been murdering us. They've been massacring us.
Yeah.
They have been involved since 2011. They have been the first foreign powers involved in Syria, and they've been actively involved in a very sectarian, very, very sectarian fight. They've, alongside the Assad regime, they've killed over 600,000 Syrians. They've conducted some of the most brutal massacres. The fall of Aleppo was primarily masterminded by Qasem Soleimani. Thousands of people, thousands of casualties over the years, thousands and thousands of casualties. The fall of Qusayr, which was the first place in Homs, which Hezbollah occupied in 2011, 2012. I can't remember the exact date of that. It's on the Lebanese border, so it was secured in order for them to be able to funnel their weapons and move it in and out, and also because Homs was a strong opposition. It was an opposition stronghold, and they needed to ensure that they had a route for their weapon supplies, and also to be able to, transfer their fighters in and out of Syria with full security, without them having to worry about rebel groups. And this is at the time. This is before the rebel groups were properly organized, when they were just more disparate groups. A lot of people were munshaqeen an nizam. A lot of the people were people who had just left the Syrian army themselves, and they were just about trying to figure out how to organize properly how to organize militarily in any capacity. Hezbollah occupied and ethnically cleansed the people of Al-Qusayr, and then they ended up living in their homes. Just a few weeks ago, there was a story of someone who had become a refugee. He was from Al-Qusayr. He was driven out by Hezbollah, ended up going to Lebanon. And the irony of being driven out of your own home to actually go to their home, and it was safer for him to be there. To be a refugee there, until Israel's aggression, Israel's war in Lebanon. He ended up coming back to Syria with the troves of Syrian refugees and Lebanese refugees who crossed the border back to Syria. He went back to reclaim his house in Al-Qusayr, and it was inhabited by people from Hezbollah. Tried to negotiate with them, and they ended up killing him for trying to reclaim his home back.
Right.
So Hezbollah have also, and Iran, they've I don't know what to tell you, Jalal. They've conducted so many campaigns against us. They've raped our women. In Homs at the time, in 2011, 2012, when Hezbollah was first deployed into Syria, and obviously it focused its efforts a lot on Homs, because, like I said, it was the opposition stronghold. My uncle at that time, Allah yarhamu, he's passed away now, but my uncle, who had never left Homs in his life, he was in his 70s at the time. There were so many people around them being raped, so many women and children around them being raped, that he said, do you know what? I'm not going to allow this to happen to my wife or my daughters or my granddaughters. He took all of them, even those who were married, and they crossed the border over to Jordan. And he ended up passing away in Jordan as a refugee, having lived the entirety of his life in Syria just a few years prior to that. And I think a lot of people are just very ignorant of this. And when you try to educate them about this, they're so caught up in this construct of anti-imperialism, but still within the nation-state framework, that they find it very difficult to accept, or they just don't want to accept because they don't want to imagine anything beyond it. Anti-imperialism is it's very noble when you actually think about it, the very concept of being anti-imperialism. But imperialism is not limited to the West. Imperialism is a concept, and anyone could be an imperial power. Any entity can be an imperial power. We see that with China. We see that with Japan. We see that with Russia, with Russian imperialism, and we see it with Iran. And Iranian imperialism doesn't just affect Syrians. It affects Lebanese. It affects Yemenis. It affects Iraqis. But people turn a blind eye to that because they're so focused on centering America. The irony of it being anti-imperialist, but they still view it from a very inherently American lens. It's like reverse American exceptionism, where America is still very much exceptionalized, but you don't see anyone else apart from it as being the evil power. And so this is where a lot of this rhetoric is coming from. A lot of this rhetoric of people calling us Zionist agents, or people calling us CIA, Mossad. And that's not to say that there have been groups that were supported by the US. But this is the case in every single, war, every single chaos, every single war, civil war, revolution, whatever you want to call it. There's always some sort of foreign involvement. This is never not the case. Even if you look at Palestine right now, look at all of the countries that are involved, and even those who are supporting the Palestinian resistance. And I'm not speaking about the Assad regime, because the Assad regime is not supporting the Palestinian resistance. It's the same conceptualization. How do you accept that, but you don't accept it from the other side? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And there were 12 groups out of about 200 splinter FSA groups. That's not even 10%. To generalize, it's completely blown out of proportion. And it's just completely disingenuous. It's just a way to ensure that the agendas of those anti-imperialists who don't see any other imperialism aside American imperialism, and who are very disingenuous in their support for the people.
Linked to that question, the other accusation, of course, is that the rebellion against Assad is not homegrown. It's a foreign rebellion. It comprises of fighters from outside Syria. Are you confident that those who are involved in these operations in Homs and in Aleppo are Syrians?
For the most part, there are definitely non-Syrians there, just as there are non-Syrians fighting against them. But we also need to understand the context of this. So when the war in Syria intensified between the opposition and between the Assad regime and its allies, and this was around 2013 all the way up until maybe 2020, a lot of people from outside Syria saw this. A lot of people from different from the Islamic faith saw this as a call for jihad. They saw this as it's our right to go and defend, or it's our right to go and fight against the Assad regime, because the Assad regime is killing our fellow Muslim brothers and sisters. This is the same call that people had in Afghanistan, the same call that people have in Palestine. It's the exact same call. It's the same concept. Whether you agree with it or not, I can't go into that. I'm not faqiha. I can't speak to that. But this is how it was being perceived by a good number of people. And so people migrated. They did leave. They ended up joining certain groups. Some people joined more radical groups. Some people joined more moderate groups. Some people ended up forming up their own battalions. And so, you'd have like an Uzbek battalion, you'd have an Albanian battalion, you'd have a Chechnyan battalion. Like, there were several different battalions who ended up working alongside the rebels at the time. And this is also, again, contextualizing this between the period of 2012 and around, say, 2016, 2017. There wasn't very much a unified military front. There were loose sort of umbrellas and loose sort of unifications. But then, because Syria was so splintered, because between the Assad regime and opposition, so the Assad regime kind of the opposition, like the opposition had a lot more hold of a lot of the land and a lot of the areas, but then at the same time they're very much surrounded by, you know, the Assad regime, etc. And so they couldn't operate on a centralized command, so it was very decentralized. And so people came and they organized and they fought, you know, along these very decentralized lines. Okay.
Razan, you know, the argument goes that at least again, and it is true, this argument really comes from many on the left who are pro-Russia, but also the Iranian partisans, that the rebellion is basically ISIS in disguise, and they incorporate the same people who committed all sorts of horrific crimes across Syria. How do you understand or answer that?
The narrative that the existing rebels are ISIS is a very strategic. It's a very strategic narrative and very much rooted in just very strategic disinformation when it comes to understanding the dynamics when it comes to Syria. They are aware that because of everyone's knowledge of ISIS in Syria, given that when ISIS entered Syria in 2014 and began beheading and killing a lot of people, and it began massacring, and it took over the news, the Assad regime capitalized on that and began calling the entirety of the opposition, even though ISIS for the most part were not opposition. ISIS for the most part were actually working hand in hand with the Assad regime, and they were actually fighting a lot of the rebel forces. And if we look to 70% at least of the battles against ISIS, which led to its defeat, they were by the Syrian rebel groups themselves. Until America came in with SDF. The SDF is backed by America and ended up swooping in the last kind of like few battles to end them off. But back to the point, the Assad regime capitalized on this narrative that the opposition are Daesh, and it's a very easy narrative and it's a very alluring narrative because it gives you this very black and white. Gives you a very black and white, you know, conceptualization, and everyone wants a black and white conceptualization because complex is too complex. Essentially, it's very easy to say, well, okay, well, he's the good guy. This is why he's massacring, because they're all extremists, and there's an element of Islamophobia over here. There's an element of Orientalism over here where you wouldn't question it because we're speaking about the Middle East. We're speaking about Muslims. So of course there's going to be a radical element over there. Of course there's going to be, of course there's going to be extremists over there because that's the land of where extremism, is that's the land of kind of like extremism, right? The Assad regime and their allies, and when I say allies, I mean Russia, I mean a lot of the anti-imperialists at the time, and also Iran, they capitalized on this war on terror language. So they began calling us terrorists. They began speaking in state security terms. Before that, the Assad regime was referring to the opposition as germs, as cancer. He called us bulls. It was kind of like insults that you would insult someone from, like, I don't know, a family member, or I don't know. Like, it was like just very childish, very bullish sort of insults.
Yeah.
When Daesh came in, they changed track. And they began really weaponizing this war on terror language to show the world, and this is why it's very weird to me that people don't see it, to show the world that we are fighting against Islamic extremism. Yeah. We are I don't know how they position themselves, but Assad generally positions himself as a very secular, progressive, modern leader. And this is back to your question right at the beginning when you asked me about Hillary Clinton and how the Assad regime was perceived. Assad regime was perceived exactly, Bashar al-Assad rather, was perceived exactly as this. He knew exactly what he was doing coming in. He positioned himself as a young, progressive, sort of, enlightened, more westernized sort of leader who was going to open up Syria to the world. And he began working with America on those bases. By the way, the Extraordinary Rendition Program, where they collaborated with America, also on this whole kind of like war on terror. They collaborated with America and would interrogate and detain people who were accused of terrorism in Syria. So a good number of people were sent to Syria from America in order to be interrogated, in order to be tortured. One of the most well-known cases is Meher Hadar, who's actually a Syrian, who was sent back to Syria, and he was tortured, and he was detained. He was tortured for several years, and then Yeah, and it was all at the hands of Syria. It was all in the hands of the Assad regime on behalf of America within this context of the war on terror. So just to go back on the Assad regime capitalizing very much on this war on terror language, they began knowing how to deal with it. They knew that if we are to show them that these are foreign elements, and they were foreign elements, but also to kind of like muddy the waters and say, well, you know, let's change the narrative. This is no longer a homegrown revolution. This is now, you know, this is now kind of like an insurgency against a very powerful, and they were very powerful, a very powerful and vicious, radical, extremist group. People will want to support me. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. The narrative changed. People no longer began referring to the Syrian revolution as a revolution. People began referring to it as a civil war, or people began to refer to it as Assad versus ISIS. The Syrian people who were being killed by both, and ISIS began killing Syrians before it began killing non-Syrians, before the massacres against the Yazidis, before the massacres against the foreign journalists, before all of that. ISIS was killing Syrians in order to consolidate its control, in order to bring in its people and to allow its people to sort of, you know, live within the area, within Raqqa at the time, the area in which it was trying to consolidate its control. It was killing all of the Syrians, and it was killing a lot of the rebel groups, obviously, who were fighting against it. The rebel groups, for the most part, were fighting on two fronts. They were fighting the Assad regime, and they were fighting Daesh. I think I wanted to finish off this point on the Assad regime capitalizing on that, and basically a lot of the people who claim to be actually fighting against America, or, you know, against America in the name of anti-imperialism, they tend to be really good allies when it comes to the war on terror and all of this war on terror language. They're the exact same people who've adopted it when it comes to Syria.
Yeah.
It's the exact same people.
Yeah, I mean, David Miller comes to mind. If you don't mind me asking you about David Miller, I mean, he's I think I live rent free in his head at the moment, because he's been sending lots and lots of refutations, or so-called refutations, my way. But he's one of them. I mean, it seems to me that he's hell bent on conveying an Iranian narrative or pro-Russian narrative, regardless of the truth. I mean, how do you describe people like this?
I don't know. White supremacy. Honestly, I genuinely don't understand it. I wish I understood it, because it would just help me navigate a lot of their narrative, and it maybe help me understand where they're coming from, and it would help me maybe, you know, just be able to have constructive conversations. They don't even care about constructive conversations. They only care about calling you all of these terms and all of these words. But David Miller accused me, and he's someone who's actually worked for Russia, or has been colluding with the Russian state. He accused me of working for America, I think the Zionist project, and then the UAE, which was very strange, which also exposes just the lack of depth that they have on Syria. They see Syria within a very limited geopolitical lens that is, for the most part, a figment of their imagination. A lot of it isn't even built on truth. A lot of it is built on rhetoric and narrative. And it's crazy to me, because I work in media. So for me, it's like, how do you not see it? You know, because for me, everything is narrative, everything is PR, everything is marketing. And we are ruled by nation states, and nation states do their marketing in the best of ways. That's why they still exist. That's why we still exist in this very violent framework of a nation state. Every single nation state subjugates its nation to violence, regardless of what you think of it, regardless of its ideology. It's a very inherently dangerous and very inherently violent ideology. How can you be understanding of this when it comes to the USA, when it comes to the UK, when it comes to, I don't know, Brazil, but then when it comes to our part of the world, suddenly we're the ones who don't understand anything, and you're the ones who have all of this enlightenment. And you end up reversing the exact same things that you're preaching onto us. Like, for me, it makes zero sense. Genuinely, it makes zero sense. I'm sorry, I don't have any intellectual contributions when it comes to this, because I can't make sense of it. I don't even know. Like, all I have to say is, I learned the word cognitive dissonance when I was active on the Palestine cause. I learned the word collateral damage when I was, I think, maybe 10 in one of the protests against the Iraq war. I remember reading them off all of these leaflets. My father was one of the organizers of those protests. And I would, like, the whole family would go out and we would walk, the entire family, and I'd be reading them as a young kid, and I'd be asking my father, what does this mean? What does collateral damage mean? What does cognitive dissonance mean? What do all of these terms mean? And a lot of these movements shaped, and like us being very active in those movements, my entire family being very, very active in this, shaped my entire sort of worldview. And I guess it's the reason why I am who I am. It's the reason why I'm very active in Syria today. The same people that I looked up to when I was younger, because they were very righteous on Palestine and they were very understanding on Palestine. And it was just very validating to see people who were non-Muslim viewing it from the same framework that you were viewing it from. And there's a lot to say about that too, but at that time it was very validating to see that. When Syria started, a lot of that came crashing down because suddenly cognitive dissonance wasn't a term that existed in their vocabulary. It wasn't a term that existed in their dictionary. Collateral damage, I realized that for all of those years that we went out on protests chanting against collateral damage, all the times that I held a banner that was handed down to me by someone from a Socialist Party worker kind of like group, or those that when they have their encampments and they hand out their leaflets and I take them on and I'd be very excited. All those times that I took that on thinking that, this is actually really great, where there's something that we're all united on when it comes to humanity. That all came crumbling down in Syria, because I realized that actually if I was in Syria, I would be collateral damage and they would be cheering it on. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult, Jalal, to actually come to that realization and to live with that. And even now at my old ripe age of 31, and as you can tell, like I'm trying not to get emotional, it's very difficult for your lives to be perceived as collateral damage by the exact same people who taught you what that term means. And for you to really understand actually what that term means. We're no longer chanting it in protests. Now it's my actual family. I know that if something happened to my aunt tomorrow, and something can happen to my aunt because she's living in Aleppo and she's living under the bombs right now. The exact same regime that was claiming to be protecting her a week ago is the exact same regime which is now raining bombs on her. If something was to happen to her tomorrow, she would be collateral damage in the minds of these people. And she wouldn't just be collateral damage. They would be calling her everything else under the sun. They would be calling her CIA, Zionist, Mossad. There's no humanization of Syrians. I think at one point I had come to the conceptualization, or I had come to the understanding at least that, okay, well, I can understand a different point of view to an extent. But I can't understand dehumanization. That's what I can't understand. I can't understand the level of dehumanization that exists, because they don't see Syria as the home for 22 million people. They don't see Syria as, 22 million lives. They don't see Syria as 12 million refugee lives or 12 million displaced people. They don't see Syria as 600,000 people killed. They don't see that. They see it as a weapon supply route. They see it as rhetoric for a dictator who hasn't even done anything. Like, if he had done something, I would understand. I understand people's support for Hezbollah. Hezbollah are genocidal, they're murderous. Hezbollah has killed some of my own family. But I understand people standing with them and people seeing them as a resistance group. I understand that. Because of what they've done. Because of how they came about, because of their entire evolution as a movement. The Assad regime does not have any of that. Why are you supporting it?
Razan Saffour, I think this has been a really broad conversation, and I can imagine a lot of people will be very happy to hear about Syria in the way you've explained it today. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.